Okay, great. Thanks. Glad to be here again at StarTech. I come every year. It's my favorite conference. I actually presented this exact project, I think 2 years ago. But back then we'd done 9 interviews or something. Now we've done closer to 100. This is joint work with Casper, who's working on his slides down the back there. And Sophia Panasiuk, who's a PhD student at Toronto, Sabina Funk, who's at Oxford, but she's coming over to us at Warwick to do a PhD, and Caroline Brett at Edinburgh. It's a spicy title. You'll see that it's a bit more complex than we're making out there. So there was a lot of motivation for this project. One was to try to identify things that determine life satisfaction that aren't in social surveys, but I'm not going to focus on that today. Today, I'm really going to focus on this validity issue in the title. So we are trying to understand what it is that we are measuring with life satisfaction scales. Like, what is this concept? What is this construct in the mind? What are we getting at? And how are we measuring it? Now, I use this word measurement very loosely. I don't think we are measuring anything. We are not going to something with a ruler. What we are doing is asking people to assign numbers to value judgments, and we want to better understand how it is that they are doing that. In particular, we are interested in the implications for statistical analysis of this sort of data. So those of you who have been following this debate, it's like Bond and Lang and this kind of stuff, you'll be aware of these assumptions already, but standardly in life satisfaction regressions, we make these assumptions. So one is linearity, which is broadly that the sort of magnitude or the amount of satisfaction that's required to change someone from a 4 out of 10 to a 5 out of 10 is the same magnitude as to change them from a 7 out of 10 to an 8 out of 10. Then intertemporal comparability, so an individual uses their scale in the same way over time. So if you interview them year after year, there's not a big qualitative change in the way they use their scale. Interpersonal, so different people do it the same way. Now, usually when you raise these kind of issues in this space, you often get waved away. This has been psychometrically validated, leave me alone. And we don't want to dispute that. But psychometric validity is not a binary thing. It's not like it is valid or it's not valid. It's valid to some extent. And life satisfaction is pushing into domains recently, particularly cost-benefit analysis, where a very high degree of precision is required. And then we are curious to what extent we can be confident in this kind of work. Now, one of the big things that we need to investigate in order to figure this out is what Andrew Oswald calls the reporting function. So this is basically that people make a life satisfaction judgment, and then they map that into a response category on the scale. So standardly, we have 11 response categories, but it might be 4, it might be 7, whatever. So we need to figure out whether this reporting function exists in a sense, what its nature is, how it works, that kind of thing. There's a few cognitive, emotional issues or problems that people need to solve while they're doing this activity. We take these ideas from Flebe and Blanchett in particular, and we use this to kind of structure the interviews that we're going to be talking to people about. So one is a scope problem. So people need to figure out what time frame to use when they make these life satisfaction judgments, and whether they just think about themselves or how their family's going. And then they also need to think about what aspects of life to consider. So we might think of the standard domains like job, health, family, relationships, but there could be all sorts of things that intrude upon someone's life satisfaction. And then we get to the ranking problem, which is basically how they weight all those different life satisfaction aspects. And then eventually we get this kind of low to high ranking of lives. And then we come to the calibration problem, which is how the person maps that potentially infinite number of lives, although that's not how we find it in the interviews, into the limited number of categories that's available on the response scale. And to try to understand why the calibration problem is such a concern, imagine 2 graders at a university. A lot of us are academics, so we know about this. 2 graders might actually assess a piece of work the same way. They might agree on everything that they think about it, but they might nonetheless map that assessment into a different number that the grade they assign to that paper. So it's the same sort of idea here. You can imagine 2 different people or 2 people, they're highly abstract. They have the same life. They make the same assessment of that life, but they map it into a different category on the response scale. So this person maps their actual life into a 6, and this person maps their actual life into an 8. And we as the researcher think that this person is more satisfied, but in fact, they just have a different reporting function. And that's kind of the issue that we're trying to get at. And there is evidence from vignette studies that different countries seem to have different reporting styles, and the genders also seem to have different reporting styles. Now, a little bit more conceptual framework here. We are very interested in investigating whether adaptation reference point shifts, and scale norming are all things that exist and whether they're different. So standardly in this literature, you come across some slightly puzzling findings, and the explanation is usually adaptation. So adaptation is where someone has a shock to their life satisfaction judgments, and then they recover from that shock back to their kind of baseline level. So you might get divorced and then you recover from that divorce. Now, sometimes this might be like acclimatizing to a hot bath. So it might be a kind of sensory thing, a biological thing. Sometimes it might be that you're doing work on yourself and so you recover. Now, this is indistinguishable in raw data. If you just have life satisfaction, this is indistinguishable from scale norming, which is a totally different thing. So scale norming is where the person's reporting style is changing over time. So here we have an individual whose life satisfaction judgment does not change over 5 waves of a survey. What's changing is the reporting style. So you can see the scale that they're using is shifting around. And we as the researcher, again, just observing their response category, think that their life satisfaction is highly volatile, but actually it's their reporting function that is highly volatile. There's a lot of evidence from this, from response shift studies in medical science that I presume Tessa is aware of. And I think this would be, to me, a much more compelling explanation for the spinal injury stuff than adaptation. And finally, we have reference point effects. So this is basically where a change in your reporting style changes the way you feel. Now, that might seem a bit puzzling at first, but that's exactly how gratitude and a lot of other positive psychological interventions are supposed to work. So change the way you do your life satisfaction answering, and it will change your actual feelings about your life. All right, so how do we start to investigate this reporting function, figure out which one of these things is going on, what is going on in general? So we have many methodologies. Eventually, we're going to get longitudinal and highly quantitative. But for now, we started with a qualitative method because we wanted to just really get into the weeds of what was going on. So we've nearly interviewed 100 people in the United Kingdom. The objective is conceptual saturation, so a diverse sample, not a representative sample. I'm pretty proud of the sample. The recruitment's very hard. We're very diverse on age, gender, sexuality, income, education, and occupation. So we have people in here who earn $250,000 a year, other people who are working as seamstresses and dependent on social housing, everything in between. I think we could do a bit better on race, but still not bad on race. The kind of questions we ask people. So we start by randomly alternating between the ONS life satisfaction question and the Cantrell's ladder of life. And then we ask them just broadly, what determines your life satisfaction? What did you think about while you were answering that question? And we go back and pick up on some of the themes that they raised. So we have a long chat with them about that. Then we ask them whether any emotions or any recent events have affected their answer. And broadly, people say no. And really, that seems to be our impression that they don't. But a lot of people do what we might call affective responding. So they just kind of check their feelings and give you an answer on that basis. Other people are much more cognitive. They have a lot of structure around why they're satisfied or not. What time frame do people consider? Really could be anywhere from my entire life, which is quite common among older people, to 5 years ago to right now, and kind of everything in between. So I think a question whether how comparable these responses are, if people have very different timeframes in mind. Do people consider just their family? Do people just think about themselves or about kind of wider society and their family? Everyone just thinks about themselves, which I actually take to be encouraging. It means there's like a consistent construct here. Almost everyone thinks society is doing worse. They would give a lower number if we asked them how society's going. We ask them what satisfied means to them, what best and worst possible life means to them. They generally interpret possible in a realistic way with just a few exceptions. And they do think that being satisfied with your life has some prudential value, like that it's morally relevant. And some people are very goal-oriented, but not everyone, and it's not even a majority thing. The questions that are really interesting for this presentation, I think, are the questions we have for the calibration problem. So we ask people, all right, so you said you were 6 out of 10. What sort of life would you need to be living to give me an 8 out of 10? What about a 4 out of 10? What would it take to move you up or down 1 point? What does the top and bottom of your scale mean? These sort of questions. And then eventually we show them this graphic. So this is about 30 minutes into the interview. And we say, okay, so the black line in the middle there at the top is this person's satisfaction running from low to high. The dot is their current level of satisfaction. And then the brackets underneath are the categories on the response scale. And you can see that the first person has a linear response category, so they have the same sized brackets, but we can imagine that other people have different ways of using their reporting function. And then we ask people, does this hit for you? Like, do you recognize what you did in this picture? Or do you think this is completely ridiculous? And if you do recognize yourself in this, and most people do, which one of these kind of is your way of using the reporting function? All right, so let me get to some of our results. The first thing I mentioned is that people find this life satisfaction question really annoying, which I was kind of surprised by. So they think, I don't go about thinking of life in terms of a scale and where I am on that scale, and I don't think I'd want to. We can't measure satisfaction by numbers. It's very difficult getting tangled up in these numbers. I find it very frustrating. This doesn't really get to the bottom of it, I think. And what's the point of answering that question? It's sort of meaningless. So I think maybe we should take a bit of pause with this. Chris, who's here, Chris Barrington Lee, yeah. So you asked me last time I presented this, and I think you were right, whether we're over-structuring with our theory of the reporting function. And there's definitely some evidence of that. So sometimes you get comments like, I just think 7, maybe, sort of a nice round number. Yeah. Or 5, that might be a little bit easier because, then there's a middle point. Then there's that, absolute worst or not quite. And then it's because it's subjective. It's just so many divisions. I'm a bit overwhelmed. And this kind of reminds me of your paper about anchoring on 10, 5, 0. So we have some evidence of that as well. We also have evidence that some people just confabulate. They kind of make up reasons for their number as they go. So health, I suppose, is another one. Oh, yeah, you didn't say that initially, but it is. Now I'm sort of trying to see what's going quickly through my head because I don't got health. Then the other factors would have probably been influenced. So it's something that I probably subconsciously took for granted. But had it been different, it probably would have been up there in the foremost factors. This is things that people are kind of backfitting to justify their answers. So having reviewed that, you might think, well, this reporting stuff is nonsense. At the same time, when we get to this question, most people find this question readily intelligible and they're very able to give an answer and they do recognize themselves in this. So about 95% of people answer this question quite comfortably. And I think perhaps alarmingly for our statistical research, linearity is very rare. So you can see only about 10% of respondents. They tend to be very analytical types, engineers, doctors. One doctor said to me, that would be the only rational way to use the scale, which I thought was very telling. What we actually find to be most common is this small increments of satisfaction to move around your current level. And that's partially because people have a clearer sense for what it would take to move up or down than for what it would take to get to other parts of their scale. But we find all the other types of scales represented. The people with this one, the random numbers, they have very clear stories about what each of these numbers mean for them. So it's not like an irrational judgment. For statistical reasons, you can see, I think pretty clearly just from this line, that if people have different reporting functions, it really runs amok a bit in our coefficient estimates and our t-stats. So the person at the top who's a 7, that overlaps with an 8 on this reporting style, overlaps with a 5 on this reporting style. So a bit of a concern. We'll have a full paper by the end of July with more formal mathematical analysis of these problems. The next thing I want to draw your attention to is that 8 out of 10 is often the top of the scale, like in half our respondents. I have a research assistant who's working on coding this, so I can just give you the raw statistical number, but a lot of people. So here's an example. The only thing that my 8 would be better in would probably be the fact that I don't actually think, I think 8 was my solid number, actually. If I'm really honest, I think what could make my life better? I don't actually know. I have no idea, but I'm still an 8 out of 10. Right? So why aren't you a 10? I don't know, but I'm definitely an 8. And we find this kind of stuff really commonly, that people would say that they can't see themselves ever giving a 10 out of 10, and there might only be a 9 out of 10 for an hour or a day. Now, this is very reminiscent, I think, of ceiling effects. So this is where if you are already at the top of your scale, so you're already an 8 out of 10, and then your life gets better, you don't really want to say that you're now a 10 out of 10, that your life is perfect, completely satisfied. So what you do instead is shift your scale. So you scale norm in the next period. And I suspect that this is what's happening. So when we ask people, like, is your life getting better? They'd be like, yes. Would you change your number? No. Okay, so ceiling effects, as I said, is very common. Those who can or do give a 10 out of 10 usually have very modest lives in mind. So, and we actually see this in parallel in the big social surveys, like the BHPS, the SOAP, this kind of stuff, that the people who are 10 out of 10, kind of objectively speaking, don't seem to have particularly grand lives. We also see this in rash analysis of life satisfaction, that above 8 out of 10, things start to get weird. Below 8 out of 10, the rash analysis is much more kind of smooth. And I think the concern here is that if positive psychology was really about studying kind of very high levels of psychological well-being, that's precisely when the measure of choice starts to sort of break down. Okay, another implication of this, so I'm a public policy scholar, so this is the stuff I'm really interested in, is how we apply this in public policy for measuring progress, the topic of today's conference. So prior to COVID, in the 2018 annual population survey of the UK's average life satisfaction was 7.7 out of 10. I'm shocked by that because I agree with Talita's suggestion. The UK is a very stressful place to be right now, but 7.7 out of 10. So if we are trying to measure progress by improvements in life satisfaction and the top of the scale is 8 out of 10, then we're already very close to it. And this kind of gives me some, and if you live in the UK, you're like, this can't be as good as it gets. So some concerns here. The bigger one for me in terms of impact evaluation is that if we have an intervention targeted at a population where the baseline level of life satisfaction is quite high, it's already 8 out of 10, then these ceiling effects will kick in and people won't have space to communicate improvements. If we target the same intervention or a different intervention at a population with a lower average life satisfaction, then there's more scope for them to report improvements. But we're not getting a reasonable comparison here. And if we are looking at things that depress life satisfaction, then we're in smoother territory. So then there's always space to go down. Right, there is evidence for adaptation. It's not really this kind of acclimatizing to a bath stuff. It's more like people do the work. So something bad happens to them and they find ways to restructure their life around it. So I won't read you this whole quote, but just the end maybe. If motherhood looks to me like being an emergency foster mum instead of a biological mum, then I haven't got a lot of choice but to accept it. It doesn't mean that grief will leave me entirely. It just means that life's just going to look a bit different, and it means that I would take a few more risks with my career. So we see a lot of this sort of evidence for when tough stuff happens to people, and over the years, their life satisfaction improves as they figure out ways to work through this stuff. There is, however, also plenty of evidence for scale norming. So I'll just give you one pull-out example because it's very striking. So we have a respondent who has very bad long COVID, and she says that she's 7 out of 10. She's 7 out of 10 because she has returned to work part-time. She's walking her dog for 20 minutes a day. Her PhD is still on hold. She says that 8 out of 10 would be returning to work full-time and being able to walk a dog up a hill. 9 out of 10 would be to get back into running regularly, and 10 out of 10 would be to be running half marathons. And I asked her, as COVID's a very big part of your life, what was your scale like before COVID in 2019? And she said, well, I was also a 7 out of 10 then. I was running half marathons regularly, and 9 out of 10 was finishing my PhD. And I said this to someone at ISQuals last year, and they said, oh yeah, she adapted. That's not how she saw it. So I asked her directly, is your scale from 2019 in any way comparable to your scale today? The respondent said, it's totally different because I would have not started from a point of extreme illness. So what does this look like graphically? So at time 1, prior to COVID, she's 7 out of 10. At time 2, the scale shrinks down. And so now she says she's 7 out of 10 again, but in terms of the underlying life satisfaction judgment, it's not giving you a comparable response. And just to back this up with another quote, so my perspective has massively changed with having to go through such bad health and such grueling recovery and affecting so many different areas of my life, not just physically and mentally, but also academically, social, in terms of work, so many different aspects. So I think that my perspective has changed completely. I think I was a different person actually, right? So I don't think these scales are comparable. Right, we also have reference point effects. So people saying things like, I realized that was just a really unhealthy way to look at myself and my life, and then that made me feel better. Or am I being selfish and being too mean and grumpy? Then I could, so changing up. All right, so summing up, I guess I've got a minute to go. Martin, is that right? Yeah. So I think broadly, like everyone is right. There are a lot of people talking about life satisfaction. I think they're all catching a piece of the elephant. So some people's life satisfaction evaluations are very cognitive. They have a lot of structure going on. That makes sense. So I think that's kind of Edina's view. A lot of people, though, are very affective in their life satisfaction evaluations. That's Bob Cummins' view. He thinks that there's nothing cognitive going on in life satisfaction. I think there's a lot cognitive going on for some people. Existing validation of life satisfaction studies is definitely borne out in our data. So people who are doing poorly tend to give lower scores. People who are doing well tend to give higher scores. So it's really about the precision. Many people do seem to confabulate. So that's the kind of mainstream economics concern with a lot of subjective data, is that you can't trust it. There's plenty of evidence for that. Scale norming, adaptation, reference points, they all exist. And I think broadly, some of the kind of subjective wellbeing epidemiology that gets done, like Carol Graham's work, for example, really kind of holds up against the issues that I've presented. Some other stuff, like I'm very concerned about Welby's analysis. I'd be very concerned about coefficient databases and things like that. A bit more questionable. Let me give some parting thoughts. Casper and I still think that maybe we can fix life satisfaction scales. By that, I mean make it compatible with marginal rates of substitution and this sort of stuff. But in order to do that, that's going to be real hard. It's going to take us ages. In order to do that, we need to do a lot of very messy, multimodal, mixed method, interdisciplinary stuff, like pretty wild, hard work that's going to be inconclusive in the short term. So if you are team life satisfaction, please don't deprive us of oxygen for that. I say this strategically. Peer review in this type of thing is volatile because mainstream economists think that this is a waste of time. And then a lot of the happiness people just circle the wagons around life satisfaction. So please don't do that. I think, we should continue to explore Welby's, this kind of stuff, but maybe we should also be a bit cautious around just replacing GDP as a unidimensional thing with life satisfaction. Like the main thing that stands out for me in our data is how immensely complicated people's lives are, and they're trying to communicate to this two in one number. Maybe we want that multidimensionality. Maybe we need to get the whole of life, as Tessa said. All right, also, we're going to share the transcripts, make them publicly available. I encourage everyone to read them. They're super interesting. Thank you.
You sure you want to go like them?
Yeah, let's go.
Well, I have a quick one, so I can just take it. I think this is something you might do in the future. Something I would love to do is, like when you say some people are evaluative, some people are more affective. I would like to see like a sort of categorization, and then you predict. Is it more like education, gender, age, this kind of thing, so that we can have sort of profile to understand what is the reporting function of this person, more or less, something in this flavor. I would really love to see this.
Okay. Yeah, great.
Thanks, Mark. This was really a fantastic presentation. I learned a lot. So very quick question. In your qualitative research, did you do vignettes a la the new work of Dan Benjamin? How ripe is this banana? I think that would be nice to get also an idea about the reporting function outside the life satisfaction question for other self-reported questions. Because perhaps that's my question is, do you think that there is one reporting function for several self-reported questions or?
Okay.
Thank you. Wonderful. I enjoyed it a lot. What you were telling, it's like going back to thinking on the field work. Like it's really lovely thinking that we're doing a great job and then being confronted with this reality. Now, well, what I was thinking, like it's a pretty simple question, or as simple as a short question. Like if you have this sort of variation within a nation or within one society, how would you then look at international, like different countries? Reflect on that, I don't know, in terms of income, different income countries, different political regimes, whatever you would like, but maybe a reflection on that. Thank you.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I was just wondering here if some of what you've said and some examples that you gave regarding the changing in scale are not just expectation driven. I mean, I think that there is a part of what you're saying that it can be interpreted as, okay, that person has changed, but in reality, the number that he or she is giving reflects the true happiness, but is a changed person. So it's not a problem of changing the scale. It's just expectation change, and we change our evaluation of same things that we in the past measured differently.
Yeah, that's true.
So he has 2 minutes to reply.
Okay, yeah, I can do it. All right, so First question was about cognitive affect and predicting the profiles. Yeah, so Casper and I and Sophia are actually talking about this exactly yesterday. So we have a research system working on this now. I definitely think we need a much bigger data set. So one of the things that we want to do is find ways to use AI to do the interviews and then recruit like 10,000 people and then start to do more of this sort of stuff. But we will have some like appendix table in this paper when it does come out where an RA has just like counted it, and I'll give you the number. I suspect that there will be some correlations. So there will be some correlations with things like people who are more affective in their responding will also have shorter time frames that they consider, things like that. Vignettes, no, I think it's probably a bit too late to include them now, but this is kind of part of a series of methodologies. And one of the methods that we want to use next longitudinally is to ask people this reporting function question and to describe in a tweet what each word means to them, and then show them in future waves, get them to do the same thing, and then say, okay, in your scale from last year, what are you today? In your scale today, what are you last year? And then on that basis, we could also like derive a vignette that's from someone's actual life as opposed to a really constructed vignette. And we might be able to like repeat Benjamin et al.'s methodology, but with not with like a how curved is this, how intense is this, but with like a life. And I think so we have to think through the maths of that a lot, but I think this has potential because I don't get the impression that there is a universal reporting function or reporting style that a person uses across all sorts of different things. But we can investigate that hopefully. International stuff. Yeah, so one thing that really I'm hung up on is that my girlfriend is Japanese, and she always says to me that, well, not always, but like one time really firmly, that in Japan, you would never say you were 10 out of 10. This is like not just culturally faux pas, but it's also not ideal. Like you want a balanced life, you want to be in moderation, these kind of things. And so we wouldn't expect these things to be comparable. So I think though, again, here, all we can do is like get a much bigger sample. So we need to, I would want to redo this project with other labs in other countries. So they also do these long cognitive interviews. And then we do some comparisons and we start to build up from there. So I'll try to recruit PhD students for this sort of thing if this publishes well. And then expectations-driven reference points. Yeah, so big question for me is like, how much can you disentangle the reporting function from the actual judgment itself? So there's sometimes evidence that they are really separable. So I think in the case of the long COVID woman, it seems like quite a separable process. In other cases, the judgment and the response category choice seem much more kind of bundled in together. I should find some quotes that kind of back that up, but I think I can do that. So I think in some cases, it does seem to be expectations driven. And I think that particularly came out with some of the miserable millionaires in the sample. But in other cases, I don't think it would be fair to say from a prudential value point of view, like from the point of view of this person's own judgment of their well-being and whether they prefer their life today compared to their life previously, or where they think they had more well-being, that the 8 today means the same as the 8 previously. Like, and if we are to take subjective judgments seriously, then we have to respect people when they say these aren't the same numbers. I think that's something that we need to grapple with a bit, but I'm still a bit agnostic. Yeah.